My cousin outbid me on my dream apartment just to see me lose, but he never saw this coming. My cousin sat at the closing table laughing as she stole the apartment I had spent 3 long years saving for, and she had the nerve to look me in the eye and call me an amateur and a loser while she signed the papers that were supposed to be mine, but she had no idea that the manila envelope I was holding was about to dismantle her entire life and strip her of her career and her dignity before the ink even dried on the contract. For the last 3 years, I had lived like a ghost in my own life. Because I am an environmental engineer in Portland, and while my salary sounds good on paper, the cost of living here is a nightmare, and I wanted that apartment more than I wanted my next breath, so I sacrificed everything. I stopped going out with friends, I stopped buying new clothes, and I drove a 2005 Toyota Corolla that sounded like a blender full of rocks. Every time I turned the key I ate rice and beans until I forgot what a steak tasted like, and I worked 60 hours a week just to see that number in my high-yield savings account crawl upward cent by agonizing cent, because I had a vision of Unit 4B in the Pearl District, which was a corner unit with original brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the kind of golden hour light that makes you feel like you finally made it in life. And I had tracked that building for 8 months waiting for a unit to hit the market, and when it finally did for $350,000, I thought my struggle was finally over. But then came the family dinner where I made the mistake of opening my mouth and telling my cousin Kelsey about my plans. Kelsey is 3 years older than me, and she is a high-end real estate broker who thinks she is the queen of Portland, and she looks at me like I am a bug on her windshield because I do not wear designer suits or drive a white Mercedes like she does. And when I told her about the apartment, I saw her eyes go cold and calculated as she pulled out her phone and said she had a client who might be interested, which was the first red flag I ignored because I wanted to believe my own flesh and blood would not stab me in the back for a commission check. But 24 hours later, my agent called to tell me that a mystery buyer had come in with an all-cash offer, $5,000 over my absolute max bid, and they had waived every single contingency, including the inspection and the appraisal, and I knew right then it was her doing because she texted me a minute later, telling me to stick to rentals in Gresham and adding a winking emoji that made my blood boil. And that was the moment I stopped being a grieving buyer and started being an engineer who looks for the structural failure in a system. So I started digging into the public records, and what I found was a pattern of professional malpractice that was so deep it was almost impressive, because Kelsey had a habit of identifying properties her own clients were bidding on and then using an LLC to outbid them herself, only to flip the property 6 months later for a massive profit, which is a total violation of her fiduciary duty. And then I reached out to a guy named Jake who worked at her firm, and he was so tired of her arrogance that he showed me the internal messages where she called me a predictable idiot and laughed about how she saw my pre-approval letter on my mom's kitchen table and used that info to calculate exactly how much it would take to outbid me. And she even lied to the sellers, telling them she was buying the place as a primary residence because she was getting engaged, when in reality she was already talking to a developer about flipping it for $100,000 profit. And so on the day of the closing, I walked into that conference room, and the silence was heavy as I set that envelope down in front of the sellers, who were this sweet older couple named the Chens, and I told them they deserved to know the truth about who was buying their home. And as they started reading the proof of her fraud and the screenshots of her mocking them and me, Kelsey started screaming that I was harassing her, but her voice cracked when she saw the copy of the formal complaint I had already filed with the Oregon Real Estate Agency, because I had documented 8 other times she had done this to her own clients. And the room went dead as the Chens realized she had played them for fools, and they canceled the sale on the spot and told her they would see her in court if she tried to sue them for breach of contract. And the fallout was glorious, because not only did Kelsey lose the apartment, but the licensing board moved faster than I ever expected, and they suspended her license for 3 years and slapped her with a $50,000 fine that wiped out her savings, and her firm fired her, and her fancy penthouse went into foreclosure because she could not afford the payments without her shady commissions. And my family tried to guilt trip me, saying that I was being cold and that family should stick together, but I told them that family does not steal from family, and I did not destroy her Career, I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the house she had burned down herself, and a month later the Chens called me and offered me the apartment at my original bid because they valued my integrity, and now I sit in that corner unit and look out those floor-to-ceiling windows, and I realize that the view from the high ground is better than any view she could have stolen because I earned every single brick in these walls while she is living in her parents' guest room and wondering where it all went wrong. And the truth is, it went wrong the moment she decided that being a winner was more important than being a decent human being. The aftermath of that day in the conference room didn't just end with a door slamming, because the ripples of Kelsey's downfall turned into a tidal wave that swallowed our entire family dynamic and left me standing on a lonely island of my own making, which was fine by me because that island had floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Willamette River that Kelsey would never get to see again. As the weeks turned into months, the reality of her situation started to set in for everyone involved. And I began to see the true face of the people I shared blood with, because my aunt and uncle didn't call to ask if I was okay or to apologize for their daughter's predatory behavior. Instead, they launched a campaign of psychological warfare that would have made a politician blush. They started by calling my parents at 3 a.m, weeping about how Kelsey was losing her hair from the stress and how her bank accounts had been frozen pending the investigation into her business practices, and they had the audacity to suggest that I was the one who had committed a crime by accessing public records and speaking to a whistleblower like Jake, as if the truth itself was the weapon, and not the lies Kelsey had been telling for a decade. My mother, who has always been a peacemaker to a fault, became the messenger for their misery, telling me at every Sunday dinner that I should just call the licensing board and tell them I made a mistake or that I was exaggerating. But I looked her in the eyes and told her that an engineer doesn't exaggerate a structural crack in a foundation, because if you ignore it, the whole building falls down and kills everyone inside, and that is exactly what Kelsey was doing to the real estate market. She was a structural failure in a designer suit, and I wasn't going to be the one to patch it up with a lie. While this was happening, I was navigating the actual process of buying the apartment, which was its own kind of emotional marathon, because every time I walked into the title company, I felt the ghost of Kelsey's smirk and the echoes of her calling me a loser. But the Chens were my saving grace, because they treated me like the son they wished they had, and they even let me come over and take measurements before the official move-in date, so I could plan out the furniture I couldn't yet afford, while Kelsey was busy selling her designer handbags and her shoes on luxury resale sites just to pay her mounting legal fees, because it turns out that when you lose your license and your reputation, the lawyers still want to be paid in cash, and they don't take excuses about family loyalty as currency. The civil suits started rolling in about 2 months after the initial complaint, because once the news broke in the local business journals that a high-profile broker was under investigation for ethics violations, the floodgates opened, and 4 of her former clients realized they had been played, just like I had been played, and they didn't have the family connection to hold them back, so they went for the throat with lawsuits that sought every penny of commission they had ever paid her, plus damages for the equity they lost out on when she outbid them using their own data. I remember sitting in a deposition room as a witness and seeing Kelsey across the table, and she didn't look like the Queen of Portland anymore. She looked like a shadow of a person with dark circles under her eyes and a cheap blazer she probably bought at a department store because her credit cards had been maxed out for weeks, and she stared at me with such pure, unadulterated hatred that I felt it in my bones. But I just sat there and told the truth slowly and methodically, like I was reading a blueprint, and the more I talked, the more her lawyer looked like he wanted to jump out a window, because there is no defense for documented fraud, especially when the person testifying against you has the receipts and the metadata to back it up. After the deposition, I walked out into the cold Portland rain and felt a strange sense of peace, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the quiet little cousin who just took the jokes and the insults. I was the man who stood up for himself and for the people she had stepped on to build her throne of lies. The family Christmas that year was a disaster, because Kelsey's parents told everyone I wasn't welcome, and my own parents were torn, so they ended up hosting a separate dinner for me, where we sat in a mostly silent house and ate turkey while the elephant in the room screamed at us. And my dad finally spoke up and said he was proud of me for having a backbone, even if it meant the family was fractured, which was the first time he had ever taken my side against the successful branch of the tree, and that meant more to me than the apartment ever could. As I started moving my boxes into Unit 4B, I realized that the silence of the apartment wasn't lonely, it was earned, and I spent Nights sitting on the floor because I still didn't have a sofa, just watching the city lights and thinking about the 3 years of rice and beans and the 3 years of being the butt of the joke, and I realized that Kelsey's biggest mistake wasn't just the fraud, it was the belief that money makes you untouchable, because she thought her commission checks were a shield against the consequences of being a terrible person. But the world doesn't work that way forever. Eventually the bill comes due, and hers was a mountain she couldn't climb. I heard through Jake that she tried to get a job at a car dealership, but they wouldn't hire her because the background check showed the pending litigation and the ethics violations, and she ended up working at a property management firm answering phones for $12 an hour, which is a far cry from the life she used to brag about at family dinners. And sometimes I wonder if she thinks about that winking emoji she sent me when she thinks she has won. Because I think about it every time I look at my mortgage statement and realize that I am building a future on a solid foundation while she is stuck in the mud of her own making. And the irony is that if she had just let me have the apartment, she would still have her career and her penthouse and her Mercedes. But her greed was so loud that she couldn't hear the warning signs, and she chose to try and humiliate me instead of just being happy with what she had. And that is the real lesson of this whole mess, because character isn't what you do when everyone is watching, it is what you do when you think you can get away with anything. And Kelsey thought she could get away with everything until she met the one person who wasn't afraid to lose the family's approval to do what was right. And now, as I look at the snow falling over the Pearl District, I don't feel like a winner or a loser. I just feel like a man who can look at himself in the mirror and know that everything in this room was bought with honest work, and that is a luxury that Kelsey will never be able to afford, no matter how many commissions she used to make. And as the years go by and the apartment value continues to rise, I know that I made the right choice, because a home is built of bricks and wood, but a life is built of truth and integrity, and mine is finally under construction in the most beautiful way possible. The silence in the apartment on that first snowy morning was unlike anything I had ever experienced, because it wasn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of a peace that I had fought for with every fiber of my being. And as I stood there in my kitchen, which was still mostly empty save for a single high-end espresso machine I had treated myself to, I realized that the true weight of the last 3 years was finally lifting off my shoulders. And I looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows where the flakes were blurring the edges of the city, and I thought about how close I had come to losing this view to a woman who saw it as nothing more than a line item on a spreadsheet. And the irony was that the apartment felt more alive than she ever did, despite her designer clothes and her loud bragging about her latest conquests in the market. While the winter moved and the news of Kelsey's downfall began to settle into the bones of the local industry, and I started hearing through Jake that the brokerage she used to work for was being forced to undergo a complete audit of every transaction they had handled in the last 5 years, because the licensing board didn't just want Kelsey's head, they wanted to know how a culture of such blatant corruption was allowed to flourish under their roof. And Jake told me that the office was a ghost town, with half the senior brokers hiring their own defense attorneys and the other half trying to scrub their digital footprints before the investigators arrived, which felt like a beautiful kind of justice, because it meant my one act of defiance had triggered a systemic cleaning of the very house that Kelsey thought she ruled over. And my colleagues at the engineering firm started treating me with a new kind of respect, because they had seen the way I handled the confrontation with Kelsey. And my boss Dave actually pulled me aside one day to tell me that my integrity was the exact reason he was putting me in charge of a massive new riverfront restoration project, which came with a significant raise. And suddenly the house per life I had prepared for was becoming a lot more comfortable. But I didn't change my habits, because the discipline of those 3 years of sacrifice had become a part of who I was. And I found that I didn't want the designer suits or the flashy cars that Kelsey worshipped. I just wanted the security of knowing that my home was mine and that I had earned it the right way. While the civil suits against Kelsey started to gain momentum in the spring, and I was called to testify one last time for a group of plaintiffs who were former clients of hers, including a young couple who had lost their life savings on a bad deal she had brokered to her own advantage. And sitting in that courtroom, I saw the full extent of the damage she had done, because these people weren't just numbers on a page, they were real human beings whose dreams had been deferred or destroyed by her greed. And I watched as the judge read Kelsey's defense, which was basically that the industry was cutthroat and she was just playing the game better than everyone else. And the judge looked her over his glasses with such profound disappointment and said that the law exists to protect the vulnerable from the predatory, and that her behavior was the textbook definition of a betrayal of public trust. And when the verdict came down and she was ordered to pay back every cent of her commissions plus punitive damages, I saw her finally break, and she didn't scream or yell. She just sat there and wept in a way that felt more like self-pity than actual remorse. And I realized then that she still didn't get it, because she wasn't crying because she had hurt people. She was crying because she had finally been stopped, and that realization made it easy for me to walk away without saying a word to her or her parents, who were sitting in the back row looking at me like I was the villain in their family tragedy. As the year turned over and I settled into the rhythm of my life in the Pearl, I started to reevaluate my relationship with my own parents, because their initial reaction to choose family loyalty over truth had left a scar that wouldn't easily heal. And we had a long dinner where I finally told them that their silence during Kelsey's bullying had been just as painful as her actual actions, and my dad apologized with a sincerity that I felt was real, but my mom still struggled with the idea that I had ruined Kelsey's life, and I had to tell her one last time that I didn't ruin anything. I just handed the mirror to the person who was already destroying themselves, and if she couldn't see the difference, then maybe we needed more time apart to figure out what family really meant. And that was a hard conversation to have, but it was necessary, because you cannot build a healthy relationship on a foundation of enabling toxic behavior. And I felt like I was finally setting boundaries that should have been there decades ago. While the summer heat started to bounce off the brick buildings, I found myself hosting a small housewarming party for the people who had actually stood by me, including Jake, who had been promoted to a senior role at a new, more ethical firm, and the Chens, who brought a bottle of champagne and told me that they had never been happier with a decision in their lives than the one to sell to me. And as we stood on the small balcony overlooking the street, I felt a sense of community that Kelsey would never understand, because she only knew how to take from people, while I was learning the joy of building something with them. And I heard that Kelsey was now working in a call center for a debt collection agency, which was a poetic kind of irony for someone who used to spend her days collecting luxury properties, and she was living in a small apartment above her parents' garage, and the white Mercedes had been repossessed and sold at auction. And sometimes I wonder if she looks at the sky and wonders how the light hits the floor-to-ceiling windows in Unit 4B, but then I realize that she probably doesn't think about the light at all. She only thinks about the money she lost, and that is why she will always be a loser, no matter how much she tries to reinvent herself. While my career continued to climb, and I was invited to speak at a conference about the intersection of engineering and ethical urban development, I realized that the story of the apartment had become a kind of local legend, and people would ask me how I had the courage to stand up to someone like her, and I would just tell them that it wasn't about courage, it was about the fact that if you don't stand for the truth, then you don't really stand for anything at all. And the view from my windows in January, as the second year of my ownership began, was just as beautiful as the first, because the brick and the glass and the wood were constant reminders of the fact that patience and integrity are the only real currencies that matter in the long run. And I think about the grocery store encounter from time to time, and I don't feel anger anymore. I just feel a profound sense of relief that I am not her, and that I never have to be, because the game she was playing was a race to the bottom, and I chose to climb a different mountain altogether. And as the snow starts to fall again and the city turns white, I take a sip of my coffee and sit in the silence of my home, knowing that it is a fortress of my own making, and that no amount of designer heels or winking emojis can ever take away the peace of a life lived honestly. And I hope that one day she finds a way to look in the mirror without flinching, but even if she doesn't, it won't affect the light in my living room or the way the sun sets over the river, because I am finally home in every sense of the word, and the view from here is absolutely perfect. The second year in the Pearl brought a different kind of clarity, because the initial adrenaline of the conflict had finally faded, and what was left was the quiet, steady reality of a life built on solid ground. And I found myself sitting in my leather chair one Tuesday evening, watching the streetcars glide through the rain and realizing that the ghost of Kelsey no longer haunted the corners of my living room. And it was a strange feeling to realize that the person who had once occupied so much of my mental space was now just a cautionary tale whispered at family gatherings I no longer attended, and the news from the legal front had finally slowed down to a trickle of paperwork and administrative updates, because the civil suits had mostly been settled out. of court, with Kelsey being forced to liquidate what was left of her trust fund and her retirement accounts to pay off the people she had defrauded, and Jake told me over lunch one day that the firm they had both worked for had officially shuttered its doors after the audit revealed a culture of noncompliance that went all the way to the top, and it felt like the end of an era for the predatory side of Portland real estate, which made my own work on the riverfront restoration feel even more significant, because I was helping to build a city that valued transparency and long-term health over quick commissions and flashy flips, and my parents eventually came around to a place of shaky acceptance after they saw that I wasn't going to budge on my boundaries, and my mom finally stopped sending me those guilt-tripping texts about Kelsey's suffering and started asking me about my garden on the balcony or the architectural details of the building, and I think she finally understood that my happiness wasn't a weapon used against Kelsey, but a byproduct of my own integrity, and I heard through the grapevine that Kelsey had tried to move to Seattle to start over, but the Interstate Disciplinary Database had flagged her license application immediately, and she was denied before she could even get an interview at a brokerage, which served as a reminder that in the digital age your shadows follow you no matter how fast you run, and she ended up coming back to Portland to work for a landscaping company doing administrative work for a fraction of what she used to spend on a single weekend in Vegas, and I felt a brief flash of something like pity when I heard that, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of her laughing at me at that closing table, and I realized that pity is a luxury you can only afford when the person in question has actually learned their lesson, and from everything I heard, Kelsey was still telling anyone who would listen that I had conspired against her and that the system was rigged against successful women like her, which told me everything I needed to know about her lack of growth. And as the summer rolled around, I decided to host a small dinner for the Chens to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of the sale, and they arrived with a photo album of the apartment from the 1970s, and we sat and laughed about how much the neighborhood had changed, and Mr. Chen told me that he had been following the news about the licensing board, and he was glad that I was the one who had brought it all to light, because it protected other seniors who might not have had an engineer for a cousin to look out for them. And that night, as I washed the dishes and looked out at the skyline, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the rice and beans and the rusty Corolla and the 3 years of silence, because they had forged a version of me that was unbreakable, and I realized that the true value of the apartment wasn't the market price, which had now climbed to nearly $500,000, but the fact that it was a physical manifestation of my refusal to be bullied or cheated, and I started to think about the future and whether I wanted to stay here forever or eventually find a house with a yard. But every time I thought about leaving, I looked at the brick walls and the timber beams, and I knew I wasn't ready to let go of this sanctuary just yet, and I started a mentorship program at my firm for junior engineers who were struggling with the cost of living in the city, and I shared my story with them not as a story of revenge, but as a story of patience and the long game, because I wanted them to know that you don't have to break the rules to win, you just have to be willing to outlast the people who do. And the feedback I got was overwhelming, with several young engineers telling me that it changed the way they looked at their own sacrifices, and that was the moment I realized that the ripples of my choice were still moving outward and changing things for the better in ways I couldn't have predicted, and I finally felt like the debt to my younger self had been paid in full, and I could stop looking over my shoulder for the next attack from Kelsey's side of the family. And as the autumn leaves started to turn gold in the park across the street, I took a long walk through the Pearl, and I realized that I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. I felt like a stakeholder in this community, and I ran into a few people who had been part of the class action suit against Kelsey, and they thanked me again with a sincerity that was humbling, and it made me realize that while I had been focused on my own home, I had accidentally helped a lot of other people find their own sense of justice, and that was a weight I was proud to carry. And I thought about the mirror metaphor again, and how Kelsey must feel when she looks in hers, and I hoped for her sake that one day she would see something other than a victim of circumstance, but I knew that wasn't my burden to carry anymore, and my life was full of light and air and the sound of the city breathing outside my windows. And as I climbed the stairs to Unit 4B, I felt a spring in my step that hadn't been there in years, and I opened the door to the smell of cedar and coffee and the sight of my books on the shelves, and I knew that this was exactly where I was meant to be, and the view from here was better than any stolen penthouse could ever be because it was framed by the truth and the knowledge that I had stood my ground when it mattered most, and the snow started to fall again just like it had on that first morning, and I sat down in my chair and just watched it blanket the world in white, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have anything to prove to anyone because the walls around me and the peace inside me were proof enough, and I lived my life with the window open to the future and the door closed to the past, and that was the greatest victory of all.